I should say that I'm a registered nurse by trade, if you have a trade. And I always just loved to read and write. And so around 1985, I got interested in the fact that West Virginia had literature, and I had not read it, and I love to read. And the reason I found that out is I went to a luncheon for the library in Clarksburg, and the people at the luncheon were Elaine Blue, African-American playwright and poet from Huntington, Julia Davis, wealthy daughter of an ambassador to England from Clarksburg, Russell Morano, first-generation Italian immigrant poet, and it was just amazing to me. Here I was in Clarksburg, and Elaine Blue lived there, Julia Davis lived there, Russell Morano lived there. And having come from a family without much money, I got interested in what did the people who were not Julia Davis write? The people that were not pro-buck, what did they write? What did the immigrants' children write? And what did the descendants of slaves write? So I started researching that. I was lucky enough to go to Morgantown to a Goldenrod Writers Workshop in about 1985 or so. And the presenter and panelist there, one of them was Norman Jordan. And luckily, he came and sat beside me at lunch. So we struck up an acquaintance immediately. And he was acquainting me then with the other African-American authors of West Virginia that I might research and find. And I think we've already known the fact that as a kid, he found out about poetry when he was homebound and had rheumatic heart disease in Ansted. His homebound teacher had him read some poetry and try to write some poetry. And that sort of got him started. And then when he went to Cleveland, things really clicked. So he had a career, to me, not just as a poet. And I think that would probably be readily understandable with all of you. He had 2 college degrees. He was a playwright. He worked with a famous first African-American drama theater in the United States. He was quite well-known during the arts movement and they called it BAM, I believe, Black Arts Movement. And then he moved to West Virginia. And I'm not sure if that didn't change things quite a bit. The civil rights era had settled down some. He was here in a different kind of environment, as you can see by looking out the window. And he began, or maybe he always had been, very contemplative, very into nature, and spiritual. And I think those things showed up in his poetry then. And Lucilla asked me if I might read some of his poems, and I liked really well, but they've already been read. He chose them, and he read them. I love the one about the tree, the grandfather and the tree in the yard. And I noticed in what I have seen of his poetry, he has at least 3 tree poems, and I'm sure he has more than 3, but he has one about the tree in the garden, he had growing where it should not be, and he has one about a tree growing on somebody's grave. And they don't want it there. The person that's dead doesn't want that tree. And they tell their family, come and help me, there's a tree here. And so I think nature and trees were important to him, and birds and butterflies and solitude. And I wrote an article about him, and I sort of stole some of his own lines when I called him Norman Jordan, the poet and the dreamer. To me, he was a dreamer. And he would dream off whether he should be dreaming or not. And one of the times I had gone to hear Brucella do her presentation on the History Alive characters that she was doing. And when I pulled into the parking lot, there was a car door open at the far end of the parking lot with music blaring and legs sticking out of the back seat. It was Norman. He had already heard her presentation probably 100 times, so he was just out there enjoying the music. And I thought, oh, only Norman would be doing this. So anyhow, he was a playwright. He was just so many things that it would be hard just to characterize him as just a poet. He was an actor, and I think we'll hear more about that later. He was a director of organizations. the museum itself, the academy, all those kinds of things. He was an activist, but he did not jump up and down and preach or do anything hasty. He had friends that would do that. Ed Cabell, Ed is not here today, but Ed did the heavy-duty complaining part, and Norman was as sweet as an angel. You know, you didn't hear anything from Norman that was negative. At least I never did, and I never. And I just thought they made such a great pair because Ed was pretty much protesting everything that came down the pike, whereas Norman was accepting it and wanting not to hurt you, you know, and for his karma to be good. So I enjoyed that. But he was an activist and he did care about what was going on in the black community. And when I had thought about saying something about him here today, I thought about saying, how many good things could I say about him? Well, I quit at 16, okay? Because there were so many good things about him. With 2 college degrees, a bachelor's and a master's, and he could teach in the classroom, he could teach at the camps, he could run a camp. He just was amazing. I never got to take a class from him, but I did get to sit in on some of his poetry workshops. But I think of him probably in 3 major ways: dreamer, nature lover, and family man. He loved his family. And I think he loved Camp Washington Carver when he was the administrator there. He loved the camp he himself organized. So I think that just the multiple talents he had, and a lot of them he used in Cleveland, a lot of them he developed while he was here later. And I was really surprised to learn he'd written several essays. I don't know why that surprised me, but he's in Golden Seal, the West Virginia Encyclopedia. He's also mentioned in the Encyclopedia of Appalachia, which is, I think, a nice honor for him. He's mentioned in many places because, as his friend from Cleveland has pointed out, he has a reputation and a name that will survive. And I don't know if you have looked at your email today, maybe the Jordan family, but I was looking last night about midnight about maybe things I had missed. He's in the Cleveland Famous People Encyclopedia. And I sent you that last night. And I thought, wow, you know, I didn't know that. You know, that's terrific. And there's a picture of him, one that isn't used very often. And so there he is in Cleveland. He's famous. I bet he'd be tickled. So what else did he do that we should remember besides be just a very kind person, kind and gentle? Well, he got a lot of awards. And I would like to mention the fact that the West Virginia Folk Life Center at Fairmont State University, it's the only one we have in West Virginia, decided to make cultural displays, and they wanted to represent the people who really built West Virginia, you know, the laborers, the immigrants, that kind of thing. And for the African American cultural exhibit, they chose some names that would be permanent at the top, and then they're going to change what you see in the display. Norman is one of the names chosen for permanent display. Wow. And I don't have a picture of that with me, but it's really pretty. And if the family hasn't seen it, you probably enjoy coming to see it. The display is very nice too. He's also, as somebody mentioned, he's on the first official literary map of the state of West Virginia. And I think that was quite an accomplishment. I hope it was for him anyway. And there was, and still is, a website devoted only to West Virginia literature. And it's the first one of its kind, and I don't think there's a second one yet even. And he gets a nice coverage on that. So if you haven't seen that, it's www.mountainlit.com. And it has a picture of Norman. It has a description of Norman and Drusilla and Ed Cabell and a bunch of other folks, so you might enjoy looking at that. What else did he do that was unusual and different? Well, this isn't number one. I wrote a poem after I had met some of the authors, and it takes 4 minutes to read it, so I'm not reading it. But it does summarize a lot of the African American authors of West Virginia. And I looked at I'm going to read you the first stanza and then tell you some of the names that are in it. It's called We Have Some Writers. And my idea behind it was to imitate the sound of galloping horses. So you're supposed to gallop along when you read this. And it was it was written in response to a poem by a Native American, Joy Harjo, and hers was We Had Some Horses. And so here we have some writers, okay? And the opening stanza says, we took Native American voices, added immigrant writers in tides, Tidewater gentry writers, mountain peasant writers, Yankee and rebel writers, Italian, Greek, Scotch-Irish writers, Appalachian African-American writers, Lebanese, Belgian, Chinese, German writers. We have some writers. And then later I named some of the specific authors that I had observed. And in that list we have J. McHenry Jones, who was the director at West Virginia State for a long time, and he's a novelist also. And we have Edward J. Cabell. We have Ann Spencer, Elaine Blue, Anne Catherine Flagg, William Denby, Henry Louis Gates Jr., Norman Jordan, hot dog, and Kirk Judd. Kirk's in the same line. He's a J. He's in there too. So anyway, we have. And I think Norman was really pleased with these things when these things occurred, but he deserved them. They weren't given to him. I think that since his death, there are some things he doesn't know, or didn't. He probably knows them. He's watching this now. But I don't know if he knew that there was a map, African American Heritage Trail, and that several of the sites on here are probably on here because of what he had done. You know, the museum, the John Henry, different things there, Booker T. Washington things. So I feel like he contributed to this, whether or not his name is on it, by the work he did. At his memorial service at Tamarack, it was standing room only. Seriously, I forget how many seats there are in an auditorium, but there's a lot, and it was standing room only. And the lineup of people who wanted to say something about Norman was lengthy. So what else happened? Since his death, I wrote an article about him, and it's in Traditions. And I have brought 3 copies up here. I don't know if there's enough for everybody. But the article is about his accomplishments, and lo and behold, since it was published in the year of 2015, that was the anniversary of the college, the university, Fairmont State, and so he's in the time capsule. He's in the 100-year time capsule because of this article, which is really was just an accident, so to speak, but that's wonderful too. And the in Kentucky they started a group that they call Afro-Latins, and Norman joined that group. They dedicated this particular book to him. And he also has poetry in the book. So that's really something he would enjoy having known. So anything else? Well, one last thing perhaps, and that is, as I went about the research, I started making posters. Well, Jim started making them for me. And we aren't funded either. We're like most other things in West Virginia. We just do it, you know. And one of the posters I made was Selected African American Authors of West Virginia. Wow. And I made this in 2000. And it's got a nice long list of authors of West Virginia on it. And of course, there is, can you see him? He's on here somewhere. He's on here. There he is. Brucella Jordan, Mitty Jordan, and Norman Jordan. And how's my time? Am I done? I just have, Brucella and I have an ongoing argument. And that is, what was that surprise anybody? Well, The reason being, I tell her that Norman came from Cleveland and he started the Black Arts Movement in West Virginia. The civil rights era was over. But what he knew and what he learned and what he saw we need to write our own dispatch. We don't want everybody else writing about us. We want to write. We need to write our own poetry. We want to describe our own culture. We want to preserve our history. And that's why he was so interested in the camp, and I encourage you to donate to the camp if that's possible. But he really was interested in that whole movement continuing without the civil rights aspect of it. And I consider his compatriots to have been Elaine Blue, poet, playwright, activist, Edward J. Cabell, good old Edward, you know, and several other people. But they all worked in a group. If you found something going on in the Black Arts in West Virginia, they were doing it. It wasn't anybody else. They were a group. They weren't always together, you know, but they did programs on Black history. And they really kept that alive. And if it hadn't been for the Jordan family, we wouldn't have near as much of that done. So last year I was fortunate enough to be a guest presenter at the camp. I think the kids thought, what is that old lady doing here? Whoa, you know, but anyway, they were very nice children, nice young people. And so I got a big kick out of them. And they seemed to really catch on. And one little fellow, I named a book by Walter Dean Myers, who was born in Martinsburg and is quite famous. And the little boy said, I've read that one. Okay, can you tell us a little about it? You know, he's a West Virginia author, famous one. And the young man, so it's been a long time since I read it, but he had read it. So it's really, really heartening to see that the children are learning about our culture in general, not just one part of it. So if you think I'm a fan of Norman Jordan's, you're right. Thank you for today. We're still going to argue about Black Arts Movement. So we're going to have to name West Virginia something else besides band. Band. That was sweet of you.
Thank you, Phyllis. The young man she was mentioning that was aware of Walter Dean Myers' work was Jordan Granger. That's his mother over there.
Oh, wow.
His grandmother.